Welcome to No Rares Required, episode 25, Rakdos Sacrifice and Removal. I've heard several people compare this set to Cube, and I must admit that I, too, feel that there are some similarities. The games feel a little chaotic, since one card can dramatically swing a game, and I found myself struggling to make sense of it all. But the way I look at this and every set is that it presents a unique challenge and an opportunity to learn. For example, I've learned the hard way to reevaluate whether my opponent's threat is worth removing, or if I should save my removal for a game-ending bomb. It's not without its frustrations, though, since a nearly identical deck can trophy or just as easily fizzle out and go 0-3. So if you're struggling, know you aren't alone, and there's some high variance in what bomb is going to get thrown at you. Do your best to plan accordingly. This set, like Cube, is usually a race to see who can play the first bomb, which is reflected in the stats that the difference between the play and the draw is slightly above average for this set. And if you lose the race to playing the first bomb, then you hope you have enough removal to deal with your opponent's game-winning threat. Which brings me to Rakdos, the archetype of removal. I still stand behind my statement that Dimir has the best removal to answer all of the crazy bombs because of the counterspells, Assimilate Essence, and Artistic Refusal in blue. But Rakdos is the second runner-up and can be a nice option if you feel that blue isn't open, since red tends to be underdrafted. My tier 1 common is Deadly Derision. You will notice a trend in this episode: removal. And Deadly Derision is the best removal at common. However, since it is the best removal, it tends to disappear by pick 2 or 3, so you're going to have to take it highly. Next up at tier 2, we have Final Flourish. You will have plenty of fodder to sacrifice in this archetype, and like Dimir, you are playing the attrition game. You want to answer whatever your opponent throws at you, and this is great for removing early threats and great at removing threats later in the game. It also tends to disappear around pick 3 or 4, so you will have to take it highly for a common. My other tier 2 common that you want as many as you can grab is Volcanic Spite. You may have heard of the acronym BREAD, or its replacement BRAVE, for bombs, removal, etc. This set is basically just BR, bombs and removal. I nearly put this at tier 3 in Rakdos, since it's best in a tempo-based strategy, since it struggles to remove larger threats. But in the end, I decided it was tier 2. You want as much removal as you can grab, and this is a good option. Like Final Flourish, Volcanic Spite disappears around pick 3 or 4, so you'll have to take it highly for a common as well. Now for the special tier 4. This tier I introduced for this set. These are cards that are one step above filler, and I usually will take fixing over them in pack 1. Nezumi Informant is great sacrifice fodder, and like Dimir, the smaller your opponent's hand, the easier it is to have an answer for everything they throw at you. It tends to get picked up at an average rate for a common, around pick 5 or 6. Rakdos has less self-mill than Dimir, but Ichor Drinker still makes great sacrifice fodder since it's basically 2 cards in 1. And it tends to go late. You can plan on picking these up around 7 or 8. Ral's Reinforcements is also 2 things of sacrifice fodder in 1. Not nearly as good as it is in Izzet. In Rakdos, it is still good enough to make the cut, and a card to plan to take late around pick 7 or 8. Marauding Dreadship is also a decent inclusion, not as good as it is in Izzet, since you don't have the combo of Tetsuko to make it unblockable, but it is still 2 cards in 1, and I will try to pick these up on the wheel, since they go late. And my last tier 4 common is Hangar Scrounger. Although you don't get the backup synergies like you might in Boros, filtering through your deck to find your arsenal of removal has been quite nice. It also goes late and can be picked up on the wheel. Now for the uncommons, and the real reason to be in Rakdos. My tier S mythic level uncommon in Rakdos is Furnace Reins. Being able to take their largest, baddest threat, smack them with it, then sacrifice it for some sort of value is what Rakdos is all about. I'll even go as far to say that without this card, I don't think you should be in Rakdos. But with this card, it's all worth it. Since you are making the game small with Informant and tons of removal, it's easy to set this up to deal damage while also being removal. It also goes late and is my signal for this archetype. You can pick these up on turn 8 or even on the wheel, and is a great sign that no one else at the table is in Rakdos. Now for tier 2. Scorn-Blade Berserker is great in decks where you want to cycle to find your removal, and in Rakdos it has its own built-in ability to sacrifice. So this tends to go late for an uncommon around pick 5 or 6, and I'll happily snag as many as I can. Next up at tier 2 we have Invasion of Asgol. It can misfire if you find yourself up against Izzet Convoke, but otherwise it is great removal. Keeping the board empty is the name of the game, and for this very reason. An edict that after you get through the 4 defense flips into Ashen Reaper. This is usually worth flipping unless it's already late in the game. A 2/1 menace that gets a +1/+1 counter every time a permanent is put into a graveyard. Something that is quite easily done with either sacrifice or removal. And this can become a huge late game threat. That is, as long as you have the time to grow it. Invasion of Asgol also makes a good signal, since Rakdos is the only deck that really aims to play it, and it goes late for an uncommon around pick 5 or 6. My last tier 2 uncommon is Invasion of Amonkhet. In pack 1, I aim to pick up blue-black or blue-red tap lands over my tier 4 commons for this very reason. This is the best uncommon in the game. The front side is a fine effect on its own, but then it flips into Lazotep Convert. This is so good. There are so many game-winning cards in this format, and hopefully you answered them with removal, and then you get to copy it with this guy. Seriously, Invasion of Amonkhet is so good. An easy splash in any black or blue archetype. It's just that good. It doesn't even go that early. You can still pick these up around 4 or 5, and I still find myself occasionally getting to run 2. Now for tier 3, Kinra's Spellspear is a bit of a judgment call. Since you aim to have a metric ton of removal, this can win you the game if unanswered. Flipping it on turn 3 is risky if your opponent has mana up, but Gitaxian Spellstalker has Ward 2, so once it's flipped, it can be very difficult for your opponent to remove. Following this up with removal on turn 4 and smacking in for 5 is a very aggressive line, but one that Rakdos should at least consider. It's alluring to many though, and is usually gone by pick 3 or 4. My last tier 3 uncommon is Invasion of Mercadia. Discarding your lands in the late game to go fishing for more removal is great. Rakdos is less concerned about tempo, so I don't find myself needing to play this on turn 2, like I might in Izzet, but the backside, Chiron Flamewright, is also less important in Rakdos, since you aren't really aiming on going wide, and it's usually better to just attack your opponent's face rather than flip. But it can still turn your unwanted lands into 2/1/1s and pump your board, which is a decent way to eventually overpower your opponent if they have survived your volley of removals. Now for the rares. I'm going to skip over some rares that were covered in previous guides. Breach the Multiverse and Tali Primal Conqueror are my 2 tier 1 rares for Rakdos. They go in every deck, except Tali, which has a hard time fitting in Boros because of the 7 cost. You tend to have a lower curve and be very aggressive in that archetype. For tier 2, we have Pile On. For 4 with Convoke, you destroy target creature or planeswalker, and then Surveil 2. Rakdos is all about removal, and this is probably the best removal in the game. There are plenty of removal options at Uncommon and Common, luckily because of how many bombs there are in this set, and Rakdos can easily hit the 7 hard removal spells, and if you're lucky, this can be one of them. Also at Tier 2, we have Hoarding Broodlord. I mentioned it in my guide to Dimir, and it's great in every black archetype. You can also have a fair number of creatures to convoke, depending on how much you have been sacrificing. Judith the Scourge Diva is a Rakdos special. For 1, a black and a red, you get a 2/2 that gives other creatures you control +1/+0, and whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith deals 1 damage to any target. Your sacrifice fodder now becomes even more removal. And my last Tier 2 rare is Glissa, Herald of Predation. This card wins you the game if your opponent doesn't have an answer for it. For 3, a black and a green, you get a 3/5 that at the beginning of combat, and don't miss that part, I've messed that up more than once by playing her after combat. She incubates twice, or she transforms all of your incubator tokens, or she gives all of your Phyrexians you control First Strike and Death Touch until end of turn. She's definitely worth splashing in any green or black archetype, and why I recommend picking up green mana in Pack 1 over Tier 4 commons as well. Now for Tier 3. I mentioned Invasion of Fiora in my guide to Dimir. It's a great card in every black archetype, and even more removal for the Rakdos arsenal. Its best archetype, in my opinion, is Golgari, so I'll cover it in more detail when we get to that archetype. Valdarin Thrillseeker I like the most in Boros, where you have the backup synergies that can really put this over the top. Or in Gruul, where you can more easily hit a big beefy green creature and hit for a massive amount of damage. But Rakdos is her 3rd best archetype, since she does involve sacrifice and can pair with the threaten or treason that is Furnace Reins. My last Tier 3 rare is Captain Lannery Storm, a 2/2 for 3 with haste that whenever it attacks it creates a treasure token. Then whenever you sacrifice a treasure, Captain Lannery Storm gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Like everyone's favorite monkey, this ramps or creates additional sacrifice fodder for final Flourish, and Rakdos is its best archetype. Now for the mythics. Chandra, Hope's Beacon. She's definitely Tier S in Rakdos. Similar to Izzet, you have plenty of spells that benefit off the passive ability that creates free copies of your instants and sorceries. Now all of your removal removes 2 targets. It's pretty broken. And she's top tier removal herself. Easy inclusion. I'm going to skip Sheoldred since I mentioned her in my guide to Dimir. She's an absolute bomb and a great inclusion in any black archetype. I put her at Tier 1 in Rakdos. I'm also going to skip Invasion of Tarkir since I covered it in my guide to Izzet. Removal that turns into a late game threat is great, and I put it at Tier 1. Rakdos does get its own special mythic, though, and that is Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. A 6/6 for a black and a red, but you have to sacrifice it unless it escaped. To escape, you have to pay double black and double red and exile 5 other cards from your graveyard, but then you get a 6/6 that whenever it enters the battlefield, so it triggers the turn it's sacrificed as well, your opponent discards a card, and unless they discard a card that is not a land, they lose 3 life. Since you are aiming to fill your graveyard with sacrifice fodder in this archetype, it's easy to pay for the escape cost, and you may also be running some Nezumi Informants as sacrifice fodder to really make your opponent's hand small. I'm going to skip Invasion of Innistrad and Sheoldred Whispering One. I covered both in my guide to Dimir, and they are 2 or 3 in every black archetype. There is no Tier 3 Mythic in Rakdos. Sorry, Urabrask, but you just didn't quite make the cut. So I'll leave you with the legendary monkey Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Although I mentioned Ragavan in my guide to Izzet, he's worth bringing up in Rakdos. Like Captain Lannery, you can use the treasure token to ramp or as sacrifice fodder. Just hope they don't play a turn 1 captive weird, and you should be in pretty good shape. That's it for Rakdos. Next week I'll be covering another archetype, so if you have one that you want to explore, just let me know in the comments below. Thank you for enjoying my guides, and taking a moment to hit like and subscribe. I will see you next week.